Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Christina Tallens, and I'm the Director of Risk Assessment Services at the Wilberforce Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Wilberforce Business Academy. And in today's webinar, we're going to be talking about grievance mechanisms and their potential to prevent cases of forced labor. So, setting up a grievance mechanism is a requirement of voluntary standards and more recently became part of EU regulations, such as the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Today, we have a presentation from Asude Oruklu, who is a business and human rights expert and who has worked on various labor and human rights projects around the world. So over the next 30 minutes or so, Asude is going to be talking about what companies can do to embed grievance mechanisms across their operations and in their supply chains. I would just like to point out that this presentation is being recorded, but we will stop the recording when we come to questions at the end. I think we'll have about 15 minutes right at the end of the presentation to go through these and have a group discussion. You can send in your questions at any time. Just use the chat box at the bottom of your screens to send in questions and we will field them to Asude. So without further ado, I'll pass you over. Asude.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you all for joining today's webinar. As Christina mentioned, I've been working as a business and human rights consultant for a while, but I've been doing my PhD in the last 1.5 years, and my focus topic is on grievance mechanisms. Generally, I'm quite proud of. I'm quite strict with the timelines and the timing, and stop talking like if I have 10 minutes, 15 minutes. But somehow, like when it comes to the thesis topic, PhD, I may, I don't know, like talk more than that is necessary. So I will try to keep it as short as is possible without having this obsession about my thesis topic. So why focus on grievance mechanism? It's because my PhD topic. No, it's because a common requirement, of course, with a great potential about like encouraging reporting of the unethical or illegal activities for early detection, for foster a positive work culture, and of course, like active management and a timely management. So based on the UN guiding principles, they have like two main functions. One is about the prevention and the other one is about the remedy. But while starting with
Linda?
this positive start, like with their potential, it's often like the way we start doing work, it's also shaped like how we think about the things. When I started working with on business and human rights, I started on the social auditing side, on the auditing part, where there's like more focus on the requirement, like what has to be done. Then I passed to the monitoring and evaluation, which is more thinking about the intent, impact, and so on. And while now looking into the grievance mechanisms, I started to think about their function more, their effectiveness. And while they are being advocated, promoted by the legal framework, by the voluntary standards, today I wanted to discuss a bit this potential, this effectiveness, how are we going to measure it? And also understand a bit like what we are talking about when we say the grievance mechanisms, and also give an overview of like what are the types and consider like how we measure this effectiveness, like what are the relevant indicators and so on. And then maybe having a more like a brainstorming session towards the end, like how do we use them, especially for the cases of severe labor exploitation, modern slavery, and forced labor. So the grievance mechanisms are a common requirement by the voluntary standards, by the ILO tripartite declaration, also UN guiding principles. So they are defined as an effective operational grievance mechanism for individuals and communities who may be adversely impacted. So it's a requirement for the companies, but also for the multi-stakeholder initiatives and industry initiatives. But in fact, like even though they were promoted by the UN guiding principles in 2011, grievance mechanisms, they have a long history. They are not created only for the human rights impact purposes, but complete mechanisms, they are often used for the human resources, for the quality purposes, for the complaints, for other topics as well. So even though like in the context of human rights impact assessment, they were being introduced, they have a long history, like within the company context, in fact, and they could be as diverse, like depending on the context of the company's ecosystem. So they may not be created only covering the issues that's linked to the human rights impact, but they may be also covering the issues such as corruption, misconduct, other customer rights, or issues related to the employers and so on. So they could be also designed in a way to receive complaints that are individual or collective from the trade unions and so on. So it all depends on the structure of the company, the multi-stakeholder initiative to decide its content. And of course, they also process like many channels, like it could be in the form of a free tool number or hotlines, it could be in the form of an email. There's also a growing interest currently now about the workers' voices tools. There could be like at the company level, open door policies and complaint boxes. And in fact, like this is a bit of a knowledge, maybe we should put it in a shelf, like thinking, while we are talking about the grievance mechanisms, especially like for users and for companies or for multi-stakeholder initiatives, like due to the diverse nature and plus like the diverse purposes that they could be used like for other issues as well, like for instance, label, trademark issues, for certification systems and so on, they are a bit difficult to review in terms of its effectiveness as well, because they target not only one topic like the human rights complaints, but they may also target other issues, other complaints, other concerns as well, depending on their scope. So why it's difficult to measure their effectiveness? The effectiveness of the grievance mechanism at the operational level, there are some guidelines from the UN Guiding Principles about legitimacy, accessibility, predictability, equitability, transparency, right, compatible, and continuous learning. But there are also certain standards in terms of operational level from the ISO. Some of the issues are matching, like in terms of accessibility or timeliness, and some of the issues are like different depending on like how these systems are used. But the one important aspect about it, those effectiveness criteria is often created in a way to measure the effectiveness of the grievance mechanism at the operational level, so procedurally. So assuming that if you will implement those measures into your grievance mechanisms, and then it will better realize its function, which is like prevention and remedy. So it's more on the procedural side of it. So if you want to, but on the other hand, if you want to measure the sense, like if the grievance mechanisms that we created as a company or multi-stakeholder initiative is effective in the sense of its intent impact. So it's allow us to prevent the issues without they are being raised, or it's allowed us to mitigate the issues on a timely way. Those operational measures are like the indicators are not fully applicable or usable. It's more like on the procedural sense if they are created correctly or not. Then when it comes to their effectiveness in terms of measuring their outcome, like if they are realizing its intended function, it's more complicated, but because they are not internationally recognized performance indicators. So I just found, like, for instance, from two organizations, like measuring the effectiveness of grievance mechanisms, like for proposal indicators, of course. One of them is from the Business Respect Human Rights, and the other one is from the UN Global Compact Australia. So they come up with certain performance criteria, like the number of grievances received, for instance, or accepted for further investigation, or rejected, or the satisfaction of the users, and so on. So those are like proposal indicators, but at the same time, it's a bit tricky, because if you will think about that loud, most organizations, they put as a key performance indicator, for instance, number of the grievances received. So if it's a high number, well, it will demonstrate that the mechanism is accessible, is being used, maybe is also being legitimate, trusted. But does it also demonstrate that it's effective? Does it create the outcome that the users are expecting? Or is it allowing also still you to prevent the cases, like receiving too much grievances? Well, in also other cases, like for instance, in the next one, they also consider decreasing number over the time as kind of like a success indicator. But at the same time, this decreasing in number of grievances may indicate maybe the right holders or the complainers initially started to use the system by having the confidence that it will solve the issues, but over the time this confidence disappears because they don't find the expected results and they stop using it. So actually that's the reason why you have like decreased number of grievances. So in fact, like in terms of its like overall effectiveness, numbers may say something, but then on the other hand, like the circumstantial part of it is just doesn't allow us to have like one indicator that will demonstrate, in fact, yes, this is like really the indicator that's demonstrating the performance of the grievance mechanism or not. But all of them can be used time to time. It's still like there's no one indicator to looking into like more on the functional way. And especially like for the remedy section, for instance, still there are some indicators about the how the users are perceived the system, whether they were satisfied with results and so on. But even like for when we think about the prevention side, it's really challenging to come up with the indicators that could allow us to measure the performance if the grievance mechanisms achieve its objective to prevent the issue. If you will come to the academic literature on that aspect, as any PhD students, of course, I started with looking into like the existing research that has been done on this topic, like from the academic side first and then from the other research organization. And this might give us a bit of an overview, but also a bit like the negative one. Because most studies, like for instance, in the academic literature, even like all, they focus on the remedy and the outcome function of the grievance mechanism. So there are almost no studies like focusing on the prevention function. So they look into the mechanism systems like most of the time as case studies or industry-based examples because they are very diverse in nature. So it's almost impossible to compare one grievance system with another. So generally they took like one company or one industry initiative and then looking into the grievances like over the year, if possible, also reach out to the users and so on and implement certain surveys or interviews and come and try to find the answer if the grievance mechanism achieved to create the results, provide the remedy for the users. And in that sense, like most of the studies, for instance, they often connected to the community and land rights or the companies who have issues about these topics or about the projects that are more linked to the indigenous communities or land rights or community rights issues. There are very few studies like focusing mostly on the grievance mechanisms. It's just targeting the workers' right or issues related to the workers' right. And I have to say that data is scarce on complaints, on transparency on that topic. There are a few organizations that are providing information on the complaint they receive, their results, their nature, and with reports and so on. And most of the cases, we will find information on the website, maybe this number of complaints received, and sometimes none. The grievance mechanisms are available, the procedure is there, but you don't know like how many grievances they received or like how it's resulted. At the company side, this information is even more probably considered as a bit maybe confidential, is not at all available online. With the multi-stakeholder initiatives, there are good examples like providing that are providing track charts and so on, but still it's very low. And I think in the study, for instance, I went through the multi-stakeholder initiatives based on the standards map by the ITC. And I found out like over 300 standards, there were like 53 of them, which has the grievance mechanisms that allow to submit complaints on human rights violations. And amount, I think like 53 of them, 14 of them have transparent information on the complaints, like how many complaints they received, results, and so on. So this is also a significant disparity in terms of transparency and predictability, because imagine like from the perspective of the users, if you don't know your complaint is registered or it's there, or if it will be like what would be the potential outcomes and so on, it becomes also less likely you will use that system or have like more confidence. And there is also the research on the research institution side, or like from the multi-stakeholder initiatives and so on. Like one of them is from the World Benchmarking Alliance, for instance. They do this annual corporate benchmarking study looking into the company's grievance mechanisms, and it demonstrates, for instance, only 5% disclose evidence and 10% provide evidence ensuring rights holders' ownership. And the International Commissions of Jurists, they published a study in 2019, and also they demonstrate the shortcomings at the operational level, especially existing imbalances of the power between the dispute, the company and the workers or the communities. And some critics argue that there is too much of a focus on the procedural aspect of it, whether the systems are meeting the operational criteria that is promoted by the UNGP. So they lose a bit the sense of raison d'etre. So neglecting the remedy part, outcome part. And then the complex structure of the supply chain often affect the right holders, and there are sometimes too many grievance mechanisms on the ground, and right holders may also consider them sometimes too far to understand like all this context. I'm going to illustrate it like with a very short example on, for instance, for the farm setting, or if you will think about a farm that is being certified, just one certification organization or voluntary standard. So if a worker, they wanted to launch a complaint, in fact, like probably those standards, they also require the farm management to set up a grievance channel, so they could go to the farm. But probably the gene will be in the same supply chain, so they could also go to the gene. They could also go to the company that is linked. But at the same time, if that farm is certified, they may also go to the certification body grievance channel. Or if they are not happy with the certification body, they may go to the accreditation body if the certification body accredited. Or if they will go to the multi-stakeholder initiative. So it's just in this environment, in fact, it's like very multi-layered. So there are like many avenues that the worker may go. Sometimes they may go to maybe none because it's just too complicated, or some of them are just too far away. It isn't realistic that they will provide remedy from their perspective. So in the other research, like more focusing on the sectoral base, for instance, on seasonal worker scheme in UK from the Nottingham University, they raised the issue about lack of awareness. So most workers, they are not aware those mechanisms exist. And in the recent ETI study that is implemented in Spain and Italy, they come up with the challenges and obstacles like the language, fear of reprisal, discomfort about direct communication, vulnerability due to lack of documentation, and so on. Rainforest Islands, they conducted a study on their own grievance mechanism and certification body, and came up with the results that there is lack of trust and transparency. In fact, like some of the mechanisms, they are not being used at all in over the years. And the Fair Labor Association study on the workers' voices, they said that like there is the preference, especially like in the agriculture from the worker side, to solve the issues like more informally, like without using the complaint mechanisms. So all of them, in fact, like all this research, like from the academic side, and then also from the civil society or multi-stakeholder side, unfortunately, in fact, demonstrate, even though there's an assumption that the grievance mechanism have like a big potential on early detection, prevention, and remedy, in reality, it's not exactly the case. So there should be some kind of a gap structurally, and how we're gonna address it. So I'm going to just brainstorm a bit like from the context of modern slavery or in severe labor exploitation, which is a very tricky topic, but at the same time also a very difficult topic to tackle for the grievance mechanisms as well, in the sense of remedy, but also in the sense of prevention. So my humble advices are like, while creating the grievance mechanism, especially for those topics, I think one issue that we need to keep in mind to assess whether the mechanisms have the potential to realize its intended function for prevention and remedy. Which means, do we structure them to address those issues in the simplest sense? If you want to use a grievance mechanism in the prevention, it means that for the scope, you need to also allow organizations to raise their concern, not just the issues that are related to non-compliance or violations. Because if you only allow organizations to reach out to you within the scope when there's a violation, you already excluded the potential for the prevention because they can't record concerns. There should be an evidence, there should be a non-compliance, there should be a violation. So it means like until the case coming to an exact forced labor issue, they can't use the system. So they should have like a really solid evidence, like without any concern or without it should be like more strict. So the more strict your system is becomes in terms of their users, or if you will limit, for instance, also the users of the system to certain groups. Only the, for instance, right holders or the those who are affected by the issue can log the complaints. So you don't allow them to also log the complaints like through the maybe third agencies or sometimes like more capable than the users. So on that sense, like the way we are creating them is really important. Like how do we define the scope and also how do we define the standard? Because again, like in a great majority of the cases, the standards, the voluntary standards or the company code of standards, they serve as like the constitution or the legal framework of the grievance mechanisms because they measure their compliance according to based on those standards. So they can also raise their complaints based on those documents, those standards, those codes. So if you will, for instance, take like a very strict definition of forced labor, without taking any list of indicators, like also the violations will be linked to the forced labor cases, then if there's a like concern about human trafficking, you will exclude it in the scope sense because your code is only referring to forced labor. And this is like also a bit a challenging topic because most organizations, like correctly, they refer to the legal definition of forced labor based on the Convention 29. But the conventions, as like many of them, they shaped by the historical context that they were created. And the forced labor convention is dated back to 1930s. So during that time, the problem was not about the private sector based forced labor, but more on the state imposed forced labor. So during all these years, ILO developed like many supervisory comments and also indicators and also guidelines. They even changed like how they identify the case of forced labor within their methodology between 2012 to 2014 with harder to see and harder to count guidelines. So taking this only strict sense definition of forced labor or prohibiting it like in the code, like without referring to any issues related to vulnerability or issues related to indicators, effectively eventually also limit the scope of the grievances. So we have to look into them like all as a system. And the last point is, if we want those groups to reach out to us, like we also have to ask, like within our mechanism, do we have the safeguarding measures for non-confident, for non-retaliation, for instance, for confidentiality, for anonymity, without having all this ecosystem of support for the users, for the potential victims, we will be expecting too much for a mechanism that is not mature enough to handle those complaints. And the second part is maybe another recommendation that I could provide is, of course, like aiming to complying the effectiveness criteria, but also setting some performance measures for the outcome level, like how we're going to measure the effectiveness of the system in terms of serving our intended aim, like for prevention, for instance, in terms of risk and so on. And the other one is about considering the grievance procedure and tools as an inherent part of the due diligence. Well, in the UNGP, they were introduced also like an inherent part of the due diligence, but unfortunately, in most of the contexts, we see grievance mechanisms like functioning as in silo, like a separate tool, but not really feed in to the whole due diligence process in terms of risk assessment, in terms of data providing and so on. And another practice that I observe a bit is like sometimes organizations, they have two different systems, like for registering the risk, which is more under the like the risk management part, and it could be called as like the incident management system or risk management system. So they also record the concerns, issues, but they are not considered as grievance mechanisms. So the grievance mechanisms scope is completely different. So it's also dividing this like two functions, so considering the grievance mechanism only as the remedy function if the violation is come through that channel, so we're going to provide the remedy, but not so much managing the risks and the incidents. And the last recommendation probably I would provide would be, please, before starting a new channel, consider cooperating and collective action with the existing one. I witness a lot, like the organizations, they come with the enthusiasm. Okay, we're gonna create a new grievance channel. It will be the best. It will be independent. It will be like a third party and so on. But we have to ask the question, like if they're already existing one, why they're not functioning, and why, if there's an issue about the trust, like what will make the new mechanism more trustworthy than the others. And like if we will have the resources to keep the boat, because within all this, like the whole investigation process and grievance management is costly, like with the human resources, with the procedures, and with the management of the cases and referral, even if it will go to up to the issues of modern slavery and so on. So it's always food for thought, maybe, like for thinking first, like what would be the organization we could cooperate on this topic, like what are the existing system and how we could improve them before creating a new one.